Thank you for joining us today. We have with us Tamer al-Badawi. Tamer is an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, one of the foremost research centers for defense and security issues in the UK. He's also an associate fellow with my old friends at CARPO, the Center for Applied Research in Partnership with the Orient, an outstanding Middle East think tank based in Bonn. He's wrapping up his doctoral degree from the University of Kent, and most importantly, he's recently started his own Substack of news and analysis on Iraq. It's called Iraq Nexus, and I encourage everyone to sign up and subscribe. Tamer, Iraq is heading into general elections on November 11. The Shia coordination framework should be in a strong position to dominate at the polls. Their main contender, Moqtada al-Sadr, is boycotting. The United States has already begun a slow but steady phased withdrawal of forces. However, there's a lot of internal division within the framework. Iran is in a weak position across the region, and IRGC commander Ismail Ghani is nowhere near as forceful or charismatic as Qasem Soleimani was. So, where do we stand? What do these upcoming elections look like, and what does it mean for the United States?
Oh, thank you, Joshua, for having me on your podcast. So basically, the coordination framework would be divided into three segments. The first one is represented by former Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, where he is trying to prevent current Prime Minister Mohammad Shia al-Sudani from securing a second term. The second part of the framework is represented in the current prime minister that is trying to secure a second term. And it's only something that Nouri al-Maliki himself managed to do, securing a second term. And the third segment of the coordination framework is basically like swinging. I mean, it's kind of trying to accommodate Nouri al-Maliki, but it's also perhaps open to a second term for Mohammad Shia al-Sudani. And those are represented in the leader of AAH militia, Qais al-Khazali, and the leader of the Hikmah National Movement, Ammar al-Hakim. Um, so those are basically the broad divisions in the coordination framework. Um, the three segments are running for elections, and they, at the same time, they would like the Sadrist movement to take part because that would boost the electoral voter turnout. The fear amongst the coordination framework leaders is that lower voter turnout is associated with legitimacy deficits that the next government may suffer. So although they are not on very good terms with the Sadrists, um, however, they are trying to convince Sadr to come back, and those negotiations. I mean, there are backdoor channels where they communicate and talk. So it doesn't seem like they have reached sort of an agreement with Sadr. However, Sadr, just as at the last moment, might encourage his followers to go and vote for certain blocs or parties who he views as competing with some of his staunchest enemies. And we're talking about Nouri al-Maliki here.
Do you think that Sadr is playing that short game in a sense that he's looking out over the next 2 weeks to see how to influence the polls? Or do you think he's playing a longer game to see if we end up in another situation, which we probably will, of an inconclusive election and months of horse trading among the Shia parties, that somewhere down the road, then we're going to see Sadr step in with protests, throwing his weight behind one candidate or another so that he can be something of a kingmaker? Is this a more short-term game, or is this a longer-term game over the next year?
I think he's keeping all of his cards ready. He asked his followers to update their biometric voter cards in April this year. So he wanted everyone to be ready for all scenarios, right? And I think he realizes that because of the geopolitical volatility of the region and the country, many scenarios could unfold, and therefore he would like to be ready for everything. Um, but I think, I mean, I believe, like yourself, he's playing the long game. He wants to see his rivals weakened in the government, and then he has the higher ground, or he has control. I mean, if basically if oil prices are low, if the government is not able to employ um, recent graduates, this means increased disenchantment. This means more anger in the streets, and this automatically feeds into Muqtada Sadr's favor. I mean, I think there is like this relationship between oil prices and Sadr's mobilization. So less oil prices means the Sadrists have the power to mobilize and shake the government. And I think he's waiting for this moment. Next year, I mean, almost I think all economists are agreeing that next year, economy in Iraq will be in a relatively poor situation as compared to this year and last year. So I think he's playing the long game, and I believe he will make a comeback, a decisive one, next year.
In terms of Prime Minister Sudani, do you think that his efforts to reach out to the transitional government in Damascus, to participate in the Sharm el-Sheikh conference on Gaza, do you think those things have hurt him by bringing him too close to the West, or do you think they've helped him by making him look more confident and stronger?
I believe the second. My, I mean, how I see this is that he went to Sharm el Sheikh and made this gesture um, to please U.S. President Donald Trump. He wanted to provide um, enough evidence that he can play ball with the U.S. so that he can secure a second term. And I think someone who was formerly part of the Dawa party under Noor al-Maliki, now he's exerting his own sort of personality, and he wants to say that he has a sort of a different approach. Noor al-Maliki opposes um, Sudanese diplomatic moves. He did Maliki in a recent podcast. He said, "Well, I don't think it's a good idea to have Iraq present in such negotiations after October the 7th." So I think Sudan is enjoying this sort of schism between him and Maliki.
Okay, well, then I have to ask about the United States. So, in the last couple weeks, there have been a lot of public gestures, of course. Um, President Trump appointed his special envoy, Mark Savaya, who's from an Assyrian Chaldean background. And he issued a statement to bring all militias under government control. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth sent a similar message saying it's Iraq's last chance to disarm the Hashid al-Shabi. And the State Department issued a statement through the spokesman saying the same thing. How do Iraqis view this new Trump administration? And do they take any of these statements seriously with any weight or serious credibility?
I mean, I think typically, yes, Iraqis do pay attention to those threats, but those threats have coincided with the elections, and Iraqi parties are very busy electioneering. And those elections are perceived as perhaps the most important elections that will define Iraq for years to come. So I think they're in this moment where they want to secure their seats first, and then they will pay attention to what is being said outside. Um, but I think it's at least taken seriously um, by some candidates. I think who might be pushing to be nominated as prime ministers. I hope I'm not drifting away from what you wanted, but one, I think, candidate to become a prime minister, Adnan al-Zurfi, a former associate of Noor al-Maliki. He was the governor of Najaf for 3 terms, and he has exceptionally good ties with the United States, with the Trump administration, and the coordination framework. So he's like the go-between. I think he's one of the people who who's warning that a strike will come unless the Iran-backed militias are disarmed, unless the PMF is maybe restructured. So I think he's someone who's trying to push the United States warnings seriously in the media as one way of promoting himself, and I think as one way of increasing public awareness that there is a threat coming. Um, yeah,
Um, I want to ask about where Iraqi politics stand today. One of the things that's notable for me when you look at the coalition, the Alliance for Reconstruction and Development, the names that we're talking about, Father al-Fayyad, we're talking about Ayad Alawi. Some of these guys had their best days a long time ago. Um, isn't this part of the problem in Iraqi politics that the older generation just doesn't want to step aside and make room for a younger generation?
absolutely. And the coalition you're talking about, it's very like heterogeneous when you put two people like Iyad Alawi and Falih al-Fayyad in one coalition. It's it's very doesn't make sense. I don't know, ideologically or in terms of of orientation. Like Falih al-Fayyad is the head of the PMF. He's on very good ties with Kataib Hezbollah, the US designated armed group backed by Iran. And Iyad Alawi is someone who has a certain past with the United States. So it's a very heterogeneous coalition. Um, and this question you ask about age, it's also, I mean, it's also represented someone like Nouri al-Maliki. And like when someone like al-Maliki is asked, why are you still in power? I mean, why are you still like doing this? He responds and says, I do this because I have a responsibility. Um, and it's kind of like taking then responsibility away from the next generation of politicians, young ones. I mean, like, because they will grow also and then they will need to govern. So therefore, they will need to be trained. And indeed, I mean, in all of those parties, there are young people. I mean, whether they have real decision-making powers or not, but I mean, it's a phenomenon you see throughout the region, like from Iran, the supreme leader, to Saudi Arabia, the king, to I mean several countries in the Gulf. So I think it's more of a, a regional problem more than an Iraqi problem that yeah that the region suffers from.
I remember talking with a friend of mine, this may have been 15 years ago or so, an Iraqi friend of mine, about why do some of these people run over and over and over again. And he tried to explain to me, I wasn't convinced that the Iraqi public wants this traditional view of the old gray-haired statesman, someone they recognize, someone they're comfortable with, someone who can play the visual role of elder patron of the country, right? Um, I didn't quite buy that back then, and I certainly don't buy it now. When you look at the census results and you think about more than a third of the population was born after the U.S. invasion of 2003, it makes you ask yourself questions like, so then what purpose do some of these mechanisms serve? What what is politics anymore in Iraq? What function does it play in people's lives? This muhassasa system, this ethno-sectarian division of government spoils that was supposed to provide stability after 2003, even though it's not written down anywhere, etc. Uh, isn't this something of a zombie lie that lives on past its natural death through institutions that now propagate it without a purpose in the public view? Or is there a reason to still have these types of mechanisms around?
Absolutely. I mean, I have a sort of an anecdote also similar to yours about age and institutions and personalities. I asked an Iraqi colleague, like, why is the Marja'iyya, the Shia institution that the Shia's most senior religious institution in Najaf, why is it always seen through the lens of the grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani? I mean, why is it not seen as sort of an institution that guarantees, for example, let's say certain balances between institutions? Why is it always Sistani, his pictures? Like, why is it not like the Vatican? Perhaps like, you know, it's an institution that will produce leaders, but it's not about leaders. Um, And I think the answer was similar to the one perhaps your Iraqi friend gave. Like people want to see a persona. Like it's this people are they're charmed by someone who has a certain history, who has a certain image. I mean, it goes to like those simple standards, like a leader and followers. Um, so I think it's something like sort of perhaps I don't know if it makes sense, but it's like in the social DNA of sometimes of societies. Like they want to see certain personalities. They want to see a cleric with white hair who's wearing a black turban, or someone who's wearing a tie, and like I think it's sometimes it's like this. But I mean, amongst the young generation of especially of the 2019 Tishrin protesters. I think many of them do believe, no, that they need politicians who look like them, who are young like them, who are more liberal-minded than the mainstream political class. Um, and I mean, I have friends in Baghdad, in Najaf, in Nasiriyah, and they're very rebellious. They're even rebellious against like pro-US Iraqi politicians. They're I mean, they want like a fully independent sort of Iraqi state who's neither pro-Iran, neither pro-US. That doesn't have a connection with the parties who founded the post 2004 process. So you have this very revolutionary sort of young Iraqi activists who want to see something new and something different, far from the faces of the traditional politicians that we have dominating the process nowadays.
Well, yeah, I'd add to that. I can remember the generation of young activists right before and during the invasion, people who had uh, grown up in Iraq and then gone to exile and wanted to come back from exile. I can remember the generation of activists in the late 2000s and early 2010s, young people who had grown up outside of Iraq, didn't really know Iraq, and were desperately trying to reconnect with Iraq and demonstrate to the West they had some authenticity. And it's very different from the generation of activists that you find today who grew up in Iraq. Maybe they went and got degrees abroad. Maybe they went to England or to America to get credentials of some sort. But they don't have to fight for their authenticity. They embody it, and they want to be able to do as they wish with their careers and their lives as a result. And very different from what came before. Um, so then, if you have to make any predictions about what we're going to see coming out of this election, it doesn't have to be specific predictions. It could be broad predictions that the elections aren't going to produce a winner right away, that we might have to have a compromise candidate, whatever it is. What are some of the things that you would feel confident saying about the next few weeks?
But okay. I think the parliament will inevitably be dominated by the parties of the coordination framework and ones who are close to them. So I think basically we'll have a parliament who's dominated by many militia connected MPs. Um, and um, and this doesn't necessarily mean that the prime minister who will come will be connected with the powers of the parties who's filling the seats of the parliament. I think the premiership is something separate because it's about bargaining between the coordination framework leaders themselves, what they think will satisfy Tehran and the United States, and also it's about the Sadrists, although they're out of power, although they're not running for elections, but they are still governing in one way or another. Doesn't mean that you're not governing because you're out of power. I mean, you have social institutions, you command millions of people on the streets. So the Sadrists also have to be satisfied about the next prime minister. Um, but I think what the coordination framework wants from the parliament is basically to have the power where, for example, the PMF would be able to defend itself, like it's in sort of in legal political means. The prime minister who's going to come, that's a separate story. But I believe, yes, I mean, simply the coordination framework, they dominate because who's else running against them? The Sadrists. They're out. I mean, they're small, like sort of secular liberal coalitions, but they're not strong enough indeed to be able to mobilize people and have like a big margin in the parliament. Or voice.
I guess the last question I have before we wrap up, I don't personally, maybe you feel differently, but I don't personally feel the US has as much influence as it once had if you go back 10 or 15 years ago. And I don't think Iran has as much influence as it once had 10 or 15 years ago. If that's the case, and you can disagree, but if that's the case, does that mean that Iraq is now able to exert its own national interests in a way that it couldn't do before? Is it capable of doing that? Or do the politics hamper Iraq from advancing its own national goals?
Um, so I think the Iranians, they still have lots of influence. I mean, despite the fact that Qasem Soleimani, he was assassinated, he was the one having lots of influence over Iraqi politics. Now Qaani is the one who's running the sort of the militant um, file of Iraqi politics, but I think still the Iranians do exert a lot. But it's like I think the Iranians are reining in everyone. They don't want any group to launch any attack in order not to provoke Israel and the United States. Um, but I think where the United States does have its sort of influence is through those, you know, is through those rapid um, ultimatums where it's like disarm or we strike. I mean, I think this scares a segment of the politicians. So I think it's going. This is going to be a mixture. Whether Iraq can exert its own sort of foreign policy, it's about whether a prime minister comes and he has the will to put national dialogue between the key leaders and try to convince them to make major compromises, for example, on militias. I think militias is an issue that it cannot be solved structurally without like national dialogue on politicians agreeing that this is not the stage where we need armed groups. We need them disarmed because we need to protect ourselves. So I think it's a if the next prime minister is able to do this and the Iranians are okay with this, and of course the United States would be happy with it. So I think we can start to have like a sort of a balance, more autonomy on the Iraqi end, where they can start to have a more sort of authentic sort of foreign policy that is not about satisfying everyone, but it's about what is good for Iraq.
Well, thank you so much, Tamer. This has been fantastic. I hope we get to talk again.
Oh, thank you very much, Joshua. I appreciate it.